At this point, Putin is like a down-on-his-luck boxer, just looking for one big fight, one last payday, to make everything all right again. That's the only reason we can find for why Russia's leader decided that now, while he is embroiled in the war in Ukraine, would be a good time to pick a fight with Japan. Putin decided to visit disputed islands, and in doing so, he reignited a border war that has simmered under the surface for decades. Japan isn't happy. The Japanese bear has been poked once more, and this time, Putin may be getting more than he bargained for, as he tries everything that he can think of to make Russia a geopolitical power once more. On August 13th, Putin crawled out of his bunker and took a trip. Russia's president didn't emerge back into the real world to do anything that might actually help the Russian people, who are increasingly suffering due to Ukraine bringing the war that Putin started back to Russia. No, Putin doesn't care about such trifling concerns. Rather, Russia's leader decided that August 13th would be the perfect date for him to go on a little trip to what Russia calls Iturup Island and what Japan calls Etorofu. That island is the largest of those that make up the Southern Kurils, and all of these islands have been occupied by Russia since the end of World War II. On the surface, there doesn't seem to be a problem here. Putin just visited Russian territory, right? Well, not exactly. Russia may occupy the Kurils, but Japan has disputed that occupation for decades. This wasn't some simple visit for Putin. It amounted to a conscious decision to poke at Japan. It was meant to remind Japan that Russia not only occupies but intends to maintain control over the Kurils for a long time. With this single visit, Putin has reignited tensions that lay dormant and triggered a series of events that have Japan on edge, could reinforce China's presence in the Pacific region, and may eventually have an impact on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but we'll be getting to all of that. Japan isn't happy about what Putin just did, though it didn't react with white-hot rage. That isn't the Japanese way. Instead, Japan's Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi labeled Putin's actions as absolutely unacceptable, followed by summoning the Russian ambassador in Tokyo for what The Guardian calls a dressing down. Russia countered by claiming that Japan was making unfounded claims on its territory in the Kurils. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did some summoning of his own, calling on the Japanese ambassador in Russia to pay him a visit. Interestingly, that ambassador didn't reply immediately. The Observer says that time was taken, likely to discuss the approach with officials back in Tokyo, before the ambassador made their way to Lavrov for a 20-minute discussion. What all of this tells us is that the Southern Kurils situation is far more complicated than Putin wants it to appear. To understand why, we need to dig a little deeper into what the Kurils actually are. The Kurils are a series of islands that stretch for around 1,200 kilometers, spanning from the northeast of Hokkaido, which is in Japan, to Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. All told, 56 islands are counted among the Kurils, with the southernmost being just 4 kilometers away from Hokkaido. So for Japan, these islands aren't part of some far-flung cluster lying somewhere off in the Pacific. They are right on Japan's doorstep, and it's the 4 Kuril islands closest to Japan, which include the one that Putin visited, that are potential flashpoints for a brewing battle between Russia and Japan. These 4 islands are disputed because of events that date back to World War II. Toward the end of that conflict, Soviet soldiers seized the islands, which Japan refers to as the Northern Territories. Such things are common in war, of course, but the tensions arise from what came after World War II ended. In 1951, Japanese representatives headed to San Francisco to sign a peace treaty, in which they renounced ownership of the Kurils to Russia. The only exceptions Japan made were the 4 islands in this long chain that are in the Northern Territories, and basically right on top of Japan's borders. Japan wanted to keep those islands. That's where the problem started. The Soviet Union chose not to sign the treaty, and these 4 islands have been disputed ever since. From that, we have some much-needed context that highlights the gravity of what Putin just did. Japan's response may have been understated, but make no mistake, there was genuine anger behind Sanae Takaichi's words. Putin visiting the particular island that he headed to on August 13th is a very intentional slap in Japan's face. And that slap was delivered at a time when Putin should be focusing on the Ukraine war and the impact that war is having on his own people. So we come to the obvious question, why visit the Southern Kurils now? There are 2 answers to this question, one strategic, and the other related to neither Russia nor Japan, but to a third player that Russia is desperate to appease, China. Starting with the strategic element, Russia wants to exercise control over its Southern Kurils for more than just having something to hold over Japan. These islands are important because of their location. The Kurils as a whole are key to Russia's Pacific Fleet, They serve as a point of embarkment for Russian warships, as well as functioning as a natural barrier between the Pacific Ocean and the Sea of Okhotsk, which the Observer says is a patch of water that Russia also uses as a location for its second strike nuclear deterrent in the Pacific region. For Putin, full control over the Kurils, including the 4 disputed islands, strengthens this deterrent, as well as Russia's Pacific position. The fact that the closest of these islands to Japan is just 4 kilometers away from Hokkaido also isn't lost on Putin. If Russia holds that island, it can pose a constant threat to Japan. Putin wants to have that threat. Japan has supported Ukraine since Putin launched his invasion, and Russia is more than happy to hold islands, legitimately or otherwise, that it can use to intimidate Japan. There is also an economic reason why Russia wants to exercise control over these islands. Ownership of the Kurils also gives whoever holds the islands ownership over the waters that surround them. Under current maritime law, every nation has the right to establish the waters around its land as territorial sea up to a distance of 12 nautical miles. There are also exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, to consider. An EEZ is an area of sea or ocean that typically extends up to 200 nautical miles from a nation's coast. Within that EEZ, a nation has jurisdiction over living and non-living resources. This typically amounts to sovereign rights related to exploring, conserving, managing, and exploiting natural resources, and can even extend to establishing artificial islands and building infrastructure. With an island chain as long as the Kurils comes a whole lot of control over water, allowing Russia to exercise fishing rights, exploit whatever natural resources might be in the waters surrounding the Kurils. However, Russia doesn't seem too concerned about the economic aspect. It's something that could be used against Japan if Russia sees fit. However, Russia has also generally allowed Japan to fish in the waters around the Southern Kurils. So this territorial aspect is more a nice card to have in the pocket than the true reason why Putin decided to pay his little visit. There is something bigger at play. Still, we can't simply ignore the strategic element of Putin's visit. Russia and Japan still haven't signed a formal treaty to end World War II because of the 4 Southern Kuril Islands. Even as Russia and Japan tried to normalize diplomatic relations in the wake of World War II, these islands have been a bone of contention, a point where former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe declared in 2019 that Japan would never sign a full peace treaty with Russia until the issue is resolved. By making his visit, Putin has basically just put himself on the front line of a border dispute that has existed for decades. It's a deliberate provocation. It's an assertion of Russian sovereignty that doesn't officially exist on islands that are part of a chain where Russia has installed ground forces, air defense systems, anti-ship missiles, and a whole host of naval facilities and military infrastructure. In short, Putin's visit was a threat to Japan. However, the threat was more of an added bonus than the main purpose of Putin's trip. Russia's leader is actually far more interested in something else that the Southern Kurils offer, a chance to build close ties with China. But before we dig into that aspect of the visit, this is a reminder that you're watching The Military Show. We make videos to explain how power moves and explore geopolitical consequences. If you're getting insight from our channel, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss what we have coming next. There is some suggestion that Putin's visit to the Southern Kurils is a direct response to a Japanese white paper that has identified Russia as an acute threat. That doesn't seem to be the case, though that white paper came out just a few days before Putin's visit. Russia had been carrying out naval drills in the region before the paper's publication. Those drills are ongoing, with the most recent involving training strikes close to the Southern Kurils. So this visit wasn't about a response either. Ultimately, it was all about China. For China, the Kurils hold a different purpose. Access through these islands offers China unfettered passage into Pacific waters, along with serving China's Arctic ambitions. In the case of the former, one of the reasons why China focuses so intently on Taiwan is that control over that territory also offers greater access to Pacific waters. If China happens to be allied with the nation that holds the Kurils, or even better, can essentially make that nation subservient to Beijing, then a war with Taiwan isn't necessarily needed. The Kurils can serve as the same sort of Pacific gateway that China is looking for. This is where Russia enters the equation, and the impact of all of this on the Ukraine war starts to become clearer. Russia has spent every day since Putin launched his invasion making concessions to China. Putin had to. When the collective West started slapping Russia with sanctions, especially on Russian oil sales, China became a lifeline. It is far from the only nation willing to buy Russia's oil, but certainly the one with the most clout and financial muscle. For 4.5 years, China has been Russia's main oil lifeline, enabling Putin to keep money pouring into the Kremlin's war chest through oil sales. And that unbalanced relationship continues to this day. China still buys around half of the oil that Russia sells, as it did in June. China is also Russia's leading buyer of coal, its second largest buyer of oil products, and also one of Russia's largest buyers of both pipeline gas and liquefied natural gas. In August, China's purchases of Russia's seaborne crude oil are estimated to amount to about 1.25 million barrels per day, Reuters reports. Russia wants more from China. Scratch that, Russia needs more from China. For instance, Russia has spent the last few years trying to convince China to work on a joint gas pipeline project. Named Power of Siberia 2, that pipeline would open the door for Russia to sell even more of its gas to China. Only China isn't biting. The project has barely gotten off the ground because China knows that it's negotiating from a position of power, and it wants Russia to make as many concessions as it can force Putin to accept before it will consider working on the project. It's all about doing what's best for China, and Russia, still stuck in the quagmire of its Ukraine war, has no other options. If it wants to sell off its resources to China, then it has to make the types of concessions that China demands. Concessions that may involve the Kuril Islands. China has been taking advantage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to make some interesting moves. For instance, Chinese maps used in 2023 used some interesting naming conventions, as they used the Chinese names for several Russian regions in the Far East, including Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. This wasn't accidental. It was an indication of China's creeping influence into Russian territory, which has been made possible because of the war in Ukraine and Putin's resulting desperation to keep Chinese oil money flowing. Perhaps we're now seeing something similar in the Kurils. On the surface, Putin's island visit appears to be about projecting power over Japan. But behind the veneer lies the real reason why Putin headed to the Southern Kurils. He needed to prove to China that he is still a loyal lapdog who will work in Beijing's interests. And right now, minimizing Japan and potentially opening up new Pacific and Arctic trade routes is very much in China's interests. Or to put it much more simply, if Japan holds the 4 disputed islands, China knows that it has no chance of controlling them. But as long as Russia is exerting its supposed control, China knows that all of the leverage that it has over Russia could one day be used to finesse those islands out of Russia's hands. There's also a strategic element of all of this for China. Right now, the Kurils are perhaps one of the biggest weak points in China's Pacific trade strategy, as well as any future plans it may have for Taiwan. Those islands being under Russian control serves Beijing well for now. A friend holding the Kurils essentially acts as China's Pacific release valve, preventing naval blockades put in place elsewhere from having their full effect. Again, we come back to Putin as China's lapdog. His visit to Etorofu was an unprovoked attempt at intimidation, but it may not have been a visit that Putin would have made without China's influence. He has a war with Ukraine to deal with after all, but Putin had to make the trip to show China that the Kurils are still under Russian control, and as long as that's the case, Russia is still useful to China, which means China will continue to buy Russian oil. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. We wonder how Putin feels knowing that Russia plays second fiddle to China on the international stage. Finally, let's come back to the point we've touched on several times already, which is that Russia is still engulfed in the Ukraine war. Putin visiting the Southern Kurils now is a mistake that could hurt Russia in the long run, all to appease Russia's Chinese paymasters. Why is it a mistake? Japan is far from some puny nation that Russia can kick around. It's a powerhouse in the process of awakening from a pacifistic slumber, and Putin's latest attempt at intimidation could prompt Japan into furthering its support of Ukraine. Even if we take away the China factor, Putin heading to disputed territory in a clear attempt to exert Russia's claim smacks of a leader who has his eyes on more than just Ukraine. Putin wants more, which is a point that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has made repeatedly over the years. Back in 2024, Zelensky was telling the world that Putin won't stop at Ukraine, highlighting the Baltic states as potential next targets. Fast forward to 2026 and Zelensky was actively claiming that Putin had started World War III. I believe that Putin has already started it. The question is how much territory he will be able to seize and how to stop him. Russia wants to impose on the world a different way of life and change the lives people have chosen for themselves, Zelensky told the BBC at the time. Japan would have been paying attention to those words. Putin's Southern Kurils visit proves Zelensky right. Russia has interests it's trying to follow outside of Ukraine, and Japan is now one of the points of focus. For Japan, this visit could be a flashpoint that prompts it to provide even more aid to Ukraine and perhaps even to take a step that it's yet to take. Japan's aid has mostly come in the form of financial assistance, humanitarian aid, and funds for reconstruction, with Japan having pledged around $20 billion by the beginning of 2026. The one thing that Japan hasn't provided to Ukraine is lethal weaponry. It has started spending money on military equipment, having invested almost $15 million into the Pearl program as of May 29th, but that money went to non-lethal equipment rather than weapons. But now, with Russia threatening its borders, Japan may look to do more. Could we see Japan head down the path of providing lethal arms to Ukraine? There are signs that this could happen. Also in May, Reuters reported that Japan's decision to ease certain export rules related to what the country can sell was seen by Ukraine as a potential pathway to getting its hands on Japanese weapons. There are also loopholes that can be exploited. For instance, South Korea has similar rules to Japan when it comes to sending lethal weapons to Ukraine. However, there are no laws saying those weapons can't be sold to other countries that might just happen to then donate or sell those weapons to Ukraine. Even if Japan isn't willing to exploit that loophole, it could also help Ukraine defensively, such as by providing Patriot missile interceptors. Japan has a large stockpile of these missiles, and an argument can be made that helping Ukraine with its air defense doesn't amount to sending lethal weapons to the country. The point we're making here is that Japan could be doing a lot more for Ukraine than it currently is. If Putin keeps poking the Japanese bear, he may create a situation where Japan starts doing more. It could start sending weapons and offering more direct support than it had before, as it knows that weakening Russia in Ukraine amounts to weakening Russia's attempts to intimidate Japan by the Kurils. Whether by his choice or China's, Putin has made a grave mistake with his Kurils visit. Japan's response has been understated publicly, but behind the scenes, this single visit could end up changing the entire complexion of the war. Somehow, Putin keeps on making mistakes that draw others into a war that is supposed to center on Ukraine. Japan isn't the only nation that's been affected. Poland is now talking about doing something so radical that it would be a true gut punch to Putin. Find out what that is by watching our video. But before you go, this channel is built by real people who care about getting the story right. Subscribe, join the conversation below, and consider becoming a member to support human-made military reporting and unlock exclusive content. And thank you, as always, for watching.